The Vurak space station floated in the black sea of space, a silent giant of steel and light inside its cold silver halls. Alien guards stood tall, their black armor shining under white lamps. The Vurak were a proud warrior race, known for discipline and order, and nothing in the galaxy surprised them anymore, or so they thought. That day, a human cargo ship docked at Bay 6. The visit was routine, a trade stop, a fuel refill, and a few hours of paperwork before leaving. But among the crew was one young human named Daniel Cole, a cargo handler with messy brown hair, a leather jacket, and an old black music player he carried everywhere. To him, it was nothing special, just music. To the Vurak, it was something they had never experienced. The station's corridors hummed with the sound of machinery as Daniel walked back to his quarters after unloading crates. He closed the door, tossed his jacket on the bed, and placed the music player on the small metal table. With a click, the room filled with a deep growl of electric guitars, pounding drums, and a voice that screamed like fire itself just outside his door. A young Vurak named Kareth froze. He had been passing by, carrying data pads for the council office, when the sound hit his ears. It wasn't like the soft chimes or slow chants of Vurak music. It was alive, violent, and yet calling to him. His chest tightened, his heart began to pound faster, and strange images flashed in his mind: battlefields, storms, fire, and a rush of strength unlike anything he had felt before. Unable to resist, Kareth stepped closer and touched the door panel. It slid open, revealing Daniel sitting on his bed. Nodding his head to the beat, Kareth's yellow eyes widened. Human. "What is this?" he demanded. Daniel looked up, one eyebrow raised. This is heavy metal," he said. Grinning, Kareth stepped inside without asking, his breathing sharp. "It feels like war and victory all at once." Daniel chuckled. "That's the point," he said, turning the volume even higher. The music exploded in the small room, the guitars screaming louder, the drums pounding like thunder. Kareth's claws flexed involuntarily, his tail twitched, and he felt his blood burn with a strange energy. It was almost too much to bear, and yet he didn't want it to stop. Suddenly, 2 Vurak guards stormed in. Drawn by the noise, "What is going on here?" The taller one barked, but when the sound hit them, both guards hesitated. One of them blinked rapidly, his grip loosening on his shock baton. "This sound, what is it doing to me?" he whispered, almost in fear. Daniel leaned back casually. "Relax, it's just music." But the Vurak didn't relax. They looked at each other with something Daniel couldn't quite read. Half alarm. "This is dangerous," the taller guard said, grabbing Kareth by the arm. "We must report this to the council." Kareth snarled and yanked his arm free. "No, you don't understand. I need to hear the rest." The guards stiffened. Not used to being defied by one of their own, Daniel paused the track, the sudden silence almost painful after the chaos of sound. All 3 aliens turned to him with tense eyes. Daniel smirked. "That was just the first track," he said slowly. "You haven't heard the good part yet." For a moment, nobody moved. The hum of the station's life support systems filled the air, and the faint blue glow from the walls painted the room in cold light. Kareth's breathing was still fast, his eyes locked on the black music player as if it were a weapon or a treasure. Finally, one of the guards spoke, voice low. "If this heavy metal can do this to trained warriors, imagine what it could do to a crowd." Daniel only shrugged. Maybe it would wake them up. He pressed play again, and the room exploded with sound once more. The guard staggered back, one gripping the wall for balance, the other shaking his head as if trying to clear it. Kareth closed his eyes and let the sound flood him, every beat of the drums syncing with the pounding in his chest. For the first time in his life, he felt something the Virac language had no word for: pure, reckless freedom, somewhere deep in the station. Alarms began to echo. Someone had reported a dangerous human sound weapon. But in that small room, the human and the alien stood side by side, heads moving to the same rhythm. Neither of them knew it yet. But this was the moment that would change the Virac forever. Asterisk, the Virac High Council chamber was never loud. It was a place of calm voices, measured words, and calculated decisions. But that morning, the air was filled with urgent whispers and the heavy steps of armored guards. Counselor Theric, the eldest of the Virac leaders, slammed a clawed hand on the table. "This is not music," he growled. "This is a mind weapon." A recording of the human noise played in the background. Even though the council had ordered it played at the lowest possible volume, even then, some of the older council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. It made their blood stir in ways they did not understand. The report from the guards was clear. 3 trained warriors had lost focus after hearing only a few minutes of it. One had even started tapping his claws on the floor in rhythm. That, Theric said, pointing at the speaker, is the sound of discipline breaking, but outside the chamber. Discipline was already breaking faster than the council could imagine. Word of the strange human battle song spread through the station like a virus. Technicians whispered about it while fixing energy relays. Dock workers hummed strange rhythms under their breath. And the young Virac were the worst of all. They wanted to hear it for themselves. Kareth had become the center of it. He couldn't stop thinking about the way the sound had made him feel stronger, freer, as if no rule could touch him. He began telling friends. And soon his small circle turned into dozens of curious faces. At night, in a dark storage room, he would gather them together. And Daniel would play short pieces from his music player. The Virac would close their eyes, their tails swaying. To the beat, some cried without knowing why. Others grinned with a hunger for something they didn't even have a name for. Daniel found it amusing at first. He had never thought of heavy metal as dangerous. It was just music he loved. But here, among the Virac, it was like fire thrown into dry grass. Even those who resisted at first would come back later, asking, "Play the loud song again." The council soon realized that simple warnings weren't working. They issued an official ban on all human music. They ordered station security to seize any human audio devices, patrols searched cargo bays and living quarters, looking for black music players and data chips. But the ban only made the hunger stronger. Virac youths began trading smuggled recordings, sometimes on old datapads, sometimes on stolen storage chips. They called it the Forbidden Pulse. And in the maintenance tunnel's dark, echoing spaces between the station's main deck secret, gatherings grew. Daniel found himself performing 4 groups of 50, sometimes 100 aliens. The sound would bounce off the metal walls, surrounding them in pure chaos and energy. One night, Kareth brought a Virac warrior named Drevin to one of these gatherings. Drevin was older, battle-hardened, and skeptical. "This is just noise," Drevin said when Daniel plugged in the speaker. But as the music started, Drevin's arms tensed, his breathing deepened by the end of the track. He was standing with his fists clenched and a wild grin on his face. Later, he told everyone that the song had given him the strength to defeat an opponent in the training arena who had always beaten him before. His story spread through the lower decks like fire. The council's fears grew. They called in their top scientists to study the effect. The scientists ran tests measuring heart rate, brain activity, muscle tension. Every result confirmed the same thing. Human heavy metal triggered a massive surge of adrenaline in Virac bodies. It was not just entertainment. It was a biological event. This, Thorax said grimly, is not music. It is a catalyst for chaos. But even as he spoke, the chaos was already out of control. Dock workers started moving faster while humming it. Security officers found themselves pounding their boots in rhythm during patrols and in the training arenas. Warriors began requesting that someone hum the loud song before duels, claiming it gave them an edge. Daniel didn't understand the full scale of what was happening, at least, not yet, to him. It was just a strange adventure in a strange place. But Kareth had begun to see the truth. "This music," Kareth whispered to him one night, "it's changing us. Human nights waking something we didn't know we had." Daniel only smirked. "Good," he said, turning the volume up, far above them, in the sealed High Council chamber. The leaders decided something drastic had to be done. They could not let this forbidden pulse keep spreading. So they made a plan, one that would force Daniel to stand before the entire council and explain himself. Whether he liked it or not, the human would soon find out just how much trouble his music had caused. The Verac station had many secrets. Some were about politics, some about smuggling, but lately, the biggest secret was the sound gatherings. They were small at first, hidden in dusty maintenance tunnels. But word spread fast. Soon, Verac from all walks of life wanted to hear the humans' battle noise. Daniel tried to keep it quiet. He didn't want to cause trouble. But every day, Kareth came to him with more requests. "They want to hear it again," Kareth said. One evening, his yellow eyes glowing with excitement, Daniel sighed. "This isn't a nightclub, it's a cargo ship." Kareth leaned closer. "It's more than music, now it's hope." That was how the idea of a bigger gathering began, not just a handful of listeners in a tunnel, but a proper concert. They found an unused cargo bay on Deck 19. Far from the council chambers, it was wide, with metal walls that would make the sound even louder. Kareth spread the word through whispers. "One night only, come hear the humans' war song." On the night of the event, Daniel stood on a stack of crates with his small speaker. He had expected maybe 30 people, but when he looked out, he saw hundreds, Verac of all ranks and colors warriors. Engineers, merchants even, a few off-duty guards. Their eyes shone in the dim light. Tails twitching in anticipation, Kareth stepped forward, raising his clawed hand for silence. "Brothers, sisters," he said, "tonight you will hear what our leaders fear most, not a weapon, but freedom." A low murmur ran through the crowd. Daniel plugged in the music player, his finger hovering over the button. "You ready?" he asked. The roar of alien voices shook the bay. "Play, IT." The first note exploded through the room like thunder. Guitars screamed, drums pounded, and Daniel's head bobbed in time with the beat. The Verac reacted instantly, tails whipping, claws tapping the floor. Some closed their eyes and swayed. Others began stomping their feet in rhythm. A warrior in the front row let out a deep battle roar, echoed by dozens of others as the music built. The crowd transformed. The normally disciplined Verac became wild, laughing, shouting, pounding their fists against the walls. Daniel had played to human audiences before, but nothing like this. Here, every sound seemed to dig into their bones. It was raw, primal energy, and they were giving it back to him tenfold, halfway through the second song. Something happened that made Daniel's skin prickle. Several Verac began to chant in their own language, matching the rhythm perfectly. It wasn't planned, was instinct. The chant grew louder until it shook the metal floor beneath Daniel's boots, up in the surveillance decks. A security officer stared at the camera feed. "What in the void is happening down there?" he muttered. Within minutes, alarms began flashing in the upper levels. Council forces were dispatched to shut down the gathering. But Daniel and the crowd didn't know or care. They were too deep in the music. A young Verac female near the back began to cry openly. Kareth saw her and smiled. "It's your first time, isn't it?" She nodded, trembling. "It feels like my blood is awake." The cargo bay doors burst open with a crash. A squad of armed guards stormed in, their boots pounding against the floor. The music hit them instantly. Some staggered, their disciplined march faltering. One guard actually stopped, staring at Daniel as if trying to understand how such a small device could cause such chaos. "Shut it down," the commander shouted. Kareth stood between the guards and Daniel, his tail lashing. "No, this is ours." The crowd roared in agreement. Daniel kept playing louder now, as if daring the guards to stop him. The commander raised his shock baton. But the moment he stepped closer, the rhythm seemed to pull him back. His grip loosened. His eyes flickered, and for a heartbeat, even he was moving to the beat. But duty won, and he gave the order. "Seize the device." Two guards lunged forward, yanking the speaker from Daniel's hands. The music cut out suddenly, leaving only the sound of heavy breathing and shuffling claws. The silence was deafening. The crowd stood frozen, still feeling the pulse of the music in their veins. The commander looked at Daniel with cold eyes. "You are coming with us, human," he said. Daniel gave a small, defiant grin. "That was just the warm-up," Kareth shouted. "We will not forget this night." The crowd answered with a unified roar, their voices echoing down the corridors long after the guards dragged Daniel away. Somewhere deep inside the council chambers, the leaders would soon realize the truth. They could take away the device, but they could not take the music out of the Virak's hearts. Daniel was thrown into a small Virak holding cell. The walls were smooth metal, the light dim, and the air heavy with silence. Through the narrow slit of the door, he could see guards walking past without looking at him. He sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, a smirk still tugging at his lips. They thought taking his music player would stop everything, but it was already too late. Up on the station's upper decks, the High Council met in private. The concert had rattled them more than they wanted to admit. Hundreds of aliens had gathered without permission. Worse, trained warriors had lost control of themselves. "This is more than a disturbance," Councillor Tharek growled. "This is a rebellion of the spirit." The order was given. All human music was now officially banned. Any Veracote caught listening would be fined, stripped of rank, or exiled from the station. Security began sweeping the lower decks, seizing devices and data chips. Signs appeared. In the corridors, large red warnings: "Forbidden sound. Report violations." But while the council tightened their grip, the beat only went deeper underground. Kareth had escaped the raid, and he was already moving, with the help of other young Varak. He built a small transmitter out of stolen parts. It was hidden in a maintenance crawlspace where no guard would bother to check. From there, they began sending out low-power music broadcasts in the middle of the night. Short bursts of heavy metal, just enough for someone with a hidden receiver to catch. The Virak called it the resistance beat. It became a symbol. A warrior would walk into the training hall humming its rhythm. A merchant would tap their claws on the counter in a pattern that meant, "I've heard it too." It wasn't just music anymore, it was a shared language. One night, Kareth visited Daniel in the cell. "Using his father's guard clearance to get in? They think they've silenced you," Kareth said quietly, "but the sound is spreading." Faster than ever, Daniel leaned forward. "Good, don't just hide it. Make them want it." Kareth's tail twitched with a grin. "We're already doing that." Meanwhile, in the training arenas, Varak fighters began secretly playing the music before duels. It became a ritual. One alien would hum the first few notes. Another would stomp the floor in time. The adrenaline hit like fire, and battles became more intense than ever before. Even some station guards started showing up to the hidden broadcasts. The council didn't know who they could trust anymore. In one cargo bay, a young engineer named Sareth managed to copy the entire playlist from Daniel's confiscated device before it was locked away. She split the songs into hundreds of tiny data packets and hid them in harmless files. Soon, they were being traded inside repair manuals, shipping manifests, even food orders. Everywhere the council looked, the music was already there, hiding. In plain sight, Daniel's time in the cell didn't break him, it gave him time to think. When Kareth returned a week later with news, Daniel's grin widened. "There's a duel coming," Kareth said. "The champion of the Varrock garrison is fighting. And half the station will be watching." Daniel leaned forward. "Then we give them a song they'll never forget." The plan was risky during the duel. Cirith would connect a hidden transmitter to the arena's sound system. When the fight began, instead of the usual ceremonial drumbeat, the speakers would roar with human heavy metal if it worked. The entire crowd, including warriors loyal to the council, would hear it at once. On the day of the duel, the arena was packed. The crowd's voices filled the air as two massive Varrock warriors stepped into the circle, high above, in a VIP balcony. Counselor Theric sat with narrowed eyes. The referee raised his hand to signal the start hand, then it hit. Guitars screamed through the arena's sound system, the drums like thunder rolling in from every direction. The warriors froze for a heartbeat. Then their movement sharpened, more aggressive, faster. The crowd went wild, pounding their fists against the railing, roaring in rhythm. Even the counselors looked shaken by the sudden surge of energy. By the end of the duel, the crowd was chanting not for the winner, but for the sound. The council ordered the speakers cut. But the damage was already done that night. The resistance beat became more than an underground movement. Tit became a rallying cry. Back in the holding cell, Daniel heard the distant echoes of the chants and smiled to himself. They could lock him away, but they could never lock away the music, and soon even the High Council would have to decide, would they keep fighting the sound, or let it carry their people into something new? Daniel's cell door hissed open without warning. Two guards stepped inside, their black armor gleaming under the dim light. "On your feet, human," one barked. Daniel stood, brushing dust from his jacket. "What's the occasion?" "The High Council demands your presence," the guard replied, his voice tight. Daniel smirked. Finally, room service. They marched him through long metal corridors, the sound of boots echoing off the walls. The station's upper decks were quieter than usual, as if everyone knew something was about to happen when the massive bronze doors of the council chamber slid open. The air inside was heavy and tense. Theric, the eldest counselor, sat in the center, his eyes hard and unblinking. The other council members watched Daniel like he was some kind of dangerous animal. "Human," Theric began, his voice deep and cold. "Your actions have thrown this station into chaos." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "All I did was play some music." "Your noise," another counselor interrupted, "has broken discipline, spread defiance, and endangered order." Daniel shrugged. "Or maybe it woke your people up." A ripple of anger moved through the chamber. "You will surrender all recordings, all devices, and swear never to play again on Varrock territory," Theric ordered. Daniel tilted his head. "Or what? You throw me back in that cozy little box downstairs?" The counselors exchanged tense glances, unused to such open defiance. Then Daniel leaned forward, his voice calm but sharp. "How about we settle this another way, one test, in front of your best?" The room fell silent. "What test?" Theric asked, narrowing his eyes. "I'll play one song for your most disciplined warriors." Daniel said, "If they can stand there, stone-faced, no movement, no reactional hand over my music, and never play again. And if they cannot?" Theric pressed. Daniel's smile widened. "Then you lift the ban, and your people get the music they're begging for." The council chamber buzzed with low murmurs. One of the counselors slammed his claw against the table. "We cannot give this human such a platform," but Theric raised a hand. Silencing them, he studied Daniel for a long moment, then said, "Very well, we accept Kareth," who had been allowed to stand in the back as a witness. Almost grinned, but kept his head bowed. The next day, the station's central hall was transformed into an open arena. Hundreds of seats were filled with Varak citizens, most of them curious, some skeptical, and many secretly excited. At the front stood a line of 10 elite warriors, their armor polished, their expressions carved from stone. These were the Varak Guard champions trained to resist distraction, pain, and fear. High above, the council sat in a special balcony, watching every movement. Daniel stood opposite the warriors, his music player wired into the hall's massive sound system. He looked up at Theric, rules still the same. Theric nodded slowly. If even one of them loses control, you win. Daniel pressed play. The first chord crashed like a meteor. The guitars howled. The drums hit like cannon fire. The warriors didn't move at first, but music wasn't a weapon of the body, it was a weapon of the heart. The rhythm began to seep into them. Their breathing growing deeper. One's tail twitched just slightly. Another's claws tapped against his thigh before he caught himself. The crowd noticed. Murmurs rising, Daniel moved closer to the warriors. The sound swelling, the song's chorus hit. A wave of raw energy and defiance that seemed to rattle the very air. The third warrior's foot began to stomp in time. The fourth's lips pulled back into something between a grin and a snarl. By the time the bridge hit, two of them were pounding their fists against their armor. The crowd roared, unable to hold back. Even those who were supposed to be silent began to shout in rhythm. One warrior gave in completely, throwing his head back and letting out a deep battle cry that echoed through the hall. It was over. Daniel had won. Thoric's face was unreadable as the last note faded. The crowd was still on its feet, chanting in unison a rhythm the council could not stop. Daniel stepped back, looking straight at the balcony. "A deal's a deal," he said, his voice carrying across the hall. The council didn't respond immediately, but the people had heard the promise, and their voices were loud. Enough to make refusal dangerous, the wreck finally stood, his tail curling slowly. "Very well, human," he said. "The ban is lifted." The roar that followed shook the walls. Kareth pushed through the crowd to Daniel's side, grinning wide. "You didn't just win," Kareth said. "You just made history." Daniel chuckled. "Good. Now let's make it louder." Asterisk, the Varak station hadn't been this alive in years. Since the ban was lifted, music poured through its corridors. Shops played it quietly in the background, warriors trained to it. And young Varak walked with a new kind of swagger. For Daniel, it felt like victory, but he didn't know that. His biggest performance was yet to come. It started with a message. Kareth rushed into Daniel's quarters, his scales glistening with sweat. "The eastern border is under attack," he said, voice urgent. Daniel sat up. "By who?" The Kragan Kareth replied darkly, "Old enemies, ruthless, fast. And they've already taken 3 outposts." The Varak military was mobilizing, but morale was low. The Kragan were feared for their relentless assaults and terrifying war cries. Even seasoned Varak warriors felt uneasy in the War Council chamber. Generals spoke in clipped, tense tones. "If we can't break their momentum, the border will fall within the week." One said grimly. It was then that General Varish, a broad-shouldered veteran with a scar across his snout, spoke up. "There is something we have." "Something new," he said slowly. The other officers turned to look at him. "The human's music," Varish continued. "We saw what it did in the duel. It turned warriors into storms. The idea was dangerous. Using foreign music in battle was untested, and some feared it could make troops reckless. But desperation outweighed caution. Varish sent for Daniel when Daniel arrived. The general didn't waste time. "You're going to play for my soldiers," Varish said, "before we launch our counterattack." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "That's not exactly a concert hall." Varish's voice hardened. "It's not for entertainment tits to remind them what they are." 2 days later, Daniel stood on the open deck of a massive Virak warship. Below him, hundreds of armored warriors waited, their eyes sharp but weary. The Kragan fleet had been sighted. This might be the last fight before the border collapsed. Daniel looked at Kareth, who stood beside him in full combat gear. "Think they're ready?" Daniel asked. Kareth bared his teeth in a grin. "They will be." Daniel's small speaker had been replaced by a full military sound system. When he pressed play, the first roar of guitars exploded across the deck. The drums thundered like the heart of a predator. Every Virak head turned, their tails beginning to lash. The rhythm dug into their bones, shoulders squared, claws flexed. And the old fear in their eyes began to burn away, replaced by something fiercer. Kareth shouted over the music, "This is our fire. This is our roar." The warriors answered, with a unified battle cry that shook the ship. Even Varish, who had been skeptical, felt his chest swell with adrenaline. He slammed his fist against his armor and bellowed, "To war." The battle that followed became legend when the Virak charged. The Kragan expected the usual controlled formations, disciplined moves. Instead, they were met by warriors who fought like living storms. Every strike carried the rhythm of the music still echoing in their minds. They didn't retreat, they didn't falter, they pushed harder with every clash. Daniel watched from the command deck, feeling the ship tremble under the chaos. It wasn't just about speed or strength. The music had made them believe they were unstoppable. And belief was the sharpest weapon of all. Hours later, the Virak fleet emerged victorious. The Kragan retreated, their ships limping back into deep space. The Virak soldiers returned, armor dented, weapons scorched, but their voices were loud. They chanted in rhythm, pounding the metal floors as if the music were still playing in the War Council chamber that night. Theric addressed Daniel directly. "Human," he said, "your heavy metal, as you call it, may have saved our border." Daniel grinned. "Told you it wasn't just noise." Even Theric allowed a faint smile. "It seems we owe you more than we realized." But as the celebration spread through the station, Daniel couldn't shake one thought. If music could win a battle, what else could it change? Kareth seemed to be thinking the same thing. "This isn't just the Virak's music anymore," he said. "It's the galaxy's, and somewhere deep in the Kragan fleet." A captured Virak prisoner whispered to his cellmates about the sound that had broken them, a sound they would never forget, because once you heard the resistance beat, it never really left you. Weeks passed since the Virak's victory over the Kragan. The warships had returned to the station, and the story of the battle music spread across the galaxy. Merchants told it in markets, mercenaries repeated it in distant ports, and smugglers carried secret recordings into worlds where music itself was banned. Daniel became a name everyone knew to the Virak. He was the voice that burns in battle. To other races, he was the human who turned war into song. But to Daniel, it was never about titles. It was about the feeling. That moment when a crowd, no matter how different, moved together to the same rhythm one day. Kareth came to Daniel's quarters with a strange glint in his eyes. "There's a summit on Vora Prime," he said. "Not just Virak delegates from half the galaxy will be there." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "And you want me to?" Kareth's grin was all the answer he needed. "If we're going to unite worlds, human, we start with a song." It wasn't easy. The summit was meant to be political, careful speeches, tense negotiations, not a concert, but General Varish and even Counselor Theric quietly supported the idea. They had seen what the music could do in war. Now they wanted to see if it could win peace. The day of the summit, the Great Hall of Vora Prime was a vast dome of glass and steel. Flags of 100 worlds hung from the walls. Delegates in every shape and color filled the seats, scaled, furred, feathered, and human. Many eyed each other with suspicion. Old grudges thick in the air. Daniel stood behind the curtain, looking out at the sea of alien faces. For a moment, he wondered if this was too much. Then Kareth stepped beside him, placing a clawed hand on his shoulder. "They'll listen," Kareth said simply. Daniel nodded. "Then let's give them something worth hearing." When he stepped into the center of the hall, the murmurs rose. Some delegates frowned. Others tilted their heads, curious. Tharek's voice boomed over the speakers. "You have all heard of the battle at the border," he said. "Today, you will hear the weapon that turned the tide, but know this: it is not for war alone." Daniel plugged his music player into the hall's enormous sound system. At first, there was only silence. Then the first note hit like a heartbeat. It rolled through the hall, deep and strong. Guitars followed, sharp and alive, the drums pounding like the march of thousands. At first, the crowd was stiff, the Virak. Warriors in the audience began to move firsttails, twitching, claws tapping. Then a group of feathered Avresh leaned forward, their crests rising in time with the beat. Even the cold-blooded Zarek began to sway, their jewel-like eyes fixed on Daniel. The song grew louder, wilder. Daniel poured everything into it, not just the energy of battle, but the joy, the freedom, the raw pulse of being alive. The music didn't care about borders or treaties. It wrapped around every listener the same way. A furred Braken merchant began to stomp her foot. A human diplomat nodded in rhythm. Then the impossible happened. An Avresh and Azaric enemies, for decades, looked at each other and started clapping in sync. The hall began to change. The air was thick with the shared beat. The delegates were no longer sitting, they were standing. Moving, roaring languages mixed in the chants, but the rhythm was the same. For the first time, the great hall of Vora Prime was not divided, was united by the time the last note rang out. The entire place was on its feet. Some cheered, some laughed, some stood silent with tears in their eyes. Daniel stepped back, breathing hard. "This," he said into the microphone, "is what we can be together." The applause shook the hall. Kareth stepped beside him, raising his claw to the crowd. "This is not human music anymore," he shouted. "It is the galaxy's anthem." Later, as the delegates filed out, deals were struck that would have been impossible an hour earlier. Former enemies exchanged words instead of threats. And everywhere, in quiet conversations, the same phrase was repeated. "Did you feel it too?" That night, Daniel and Kareth stood on the station's viewing deck. Looking out at the stars, "You changed them," Kareth said. "Not with weapons, not with power, but with sound." Daniel smirked. "Music's the oldest weapon we've got." Kareth tilted his head. "What now?" Daniel's eyes glinted. "Now, we make it louder, somewhere deep in the black of space." Ships carried the recordings outward. Soon, worlds Daniel had never seen would hear the pulse. And when they did, they would know once you heard the beat, you could never go back to silence.